Welcome. Thanks for joining this session today. I think it was called a lecture somewhere. It's definitely not a lecture. I don't see it as a lecture. I won't be teaching you anything, but I'll be sharing my ideas, perspectives, and really inviting you to reflect on and make sense of what I share in your own way. By the end of the 90 minutes together, we'll have explored this concept of radical self-care. We would have engaged in some practices and hopefully had a chance to discuss some ideas as well. And you might even leave with some new perspectives on becoming a force for good in the world. But we'll see. As you said, my name is Steve, co-founder and chief wellbeing officer at Unmind. So we are a leading workplace mental health and wellbeing startup. We serve over 2 million employees globally, and we've been around for about 8 years. It's been a rewarding and challenging 8 years, and I'm really proud of the impact that the 400 plus Unmind employees over the years have had on people's lives. I've been in the space, the well-being space, for about 14 years now. At one point, this definitely would have been an unlikely career for me. I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but I want to just give add a bit of color to my background and past. So like 23 years ago when I was 23, so giving away my age here, I found myself standing in front of a tree, and I had been repeatedly hitting my head against this tree trunk. So this really like self-destructive act, it symbolized years of depression and insomnia and loneliness and hopelessness in the 5 years preceding that moment. And it became somewhat of a wake-up call for me as I literally just stared at my own blood on the bark of the tree. Soon after this, and with a lot of support from loved ones, I guess I began to change my life. I returned to South Africa after being in the UK for a few years. I am South African, you probably can tell. And I started to find some joy and fulfillment again through studying and making music. Although it took quite a few more years before I was able to really overcome my struggles fully. I left my studies after a few years because I was presented with this opportunity, which then led to me working in the entertainment industry for about 5 years as a singer, an actor, and a performer. There were parts of that I loved, but there were also parts that were really, really bad for me in retrospect. And it got to a point where I decided to sort of get away from things. I took a role as a singer on a cruise ship, which I did for almost like 2 years. I really did get away from things. I had lots of time to be by myself. I only sang like twice every 2 weeks. So I read a lot, bought lots of books, became really interested in philosophy and spirituality and psychology and the human potential movement. And all of this stuff, I guess, influenced me and helped me to start making more changes in my life. And my well-being started to improve dramatically. So after my contract was up, I felt called to a different direction in my career. And I had this sort of growing sense of vision of somehow helping people cultivate well-being in their life by finding more energy, more beauty, more self-belief, more compassion, more fulfillment. And I didn't really know how I was going to do that, but it did feel like a strong calling as such. So at about the age of 32, I had the strong calling, but I felt like I didn't have the time or the money at that point to go and study for 10 years to become a psychologist. And so I guess I chose what I viewed as the easiest entry point into being able to help people. And this was 15 years ago. And so I qualified as a personal trainer. That's the route that I took. I then became a CHEK practitioner, which is a corrective exercise specialist and holistic sort of coach. I moved into holistic coaching and corporate wellness. I'm fast forwarding a few things here, but then a pivotal moment came when I was given an opportunity to oversee the wellbeing strategy and wellbeing program for a business consultancy in Joburg, which I ended up doing for 2 years. We ended up, I don't know if you know Vitality, I think you probably know Vitality, the insurance company, and they run these annual Healthiest Company Awards, and we won Healthiest SME back in South Africa. This led to other opportunities. I joined a company called Mind for Revolution, and it was there that my business partner, who was the owner of that company, introduced me to a man called Dr. Nick Taylor, who was working at the time in the NHS as a lead clinical psychologist. It wasn't long after that, through a lot of like back and forth, I was in Cape Town at the time, he was in London, that we recognized our common aspirations, our common visions, albeit through different ends of the mental health spectrum, him problems, me on sort of the flourishing side. And we co-founded Unmind in late 2016. So, like I said, Unmind has been a journey I've been really proud of. I've had the privilege of working with brilliant colleagues and also brilliant experts, the likes of Professor Paul Gilbert, the founder of Compassionate Focused Therapy, Professor Jason Ellis, the world's first sleep professor, Ruby Wax, and I could really really list a long name of brilliant minds that I feel so grateful to have had an opportunity to get to know and work with. Their insights have been invaluable in helping me to grow over the years as a leader, as a human being, and also develop my understanding of mental health and well-being. And so, like I said, today Unmind's a global company. We're impacting lives worldwide. And I've had the privilege to be able to really immerse myself in all things well-being. And so I tell you all this to tell you that I'm not a psychologist, but that I have, I guess, acquired a lot of insight and depth of knowledge by virtue of who I've been able to work with and just like the work that I've been doing, right? That bio was definitely longer than usual, but I wanted this to be somewhat personal given the topic today. And I wanted you just to get a sense of where I'm coming from when I share what I'm sharing with you. So thanks for listening to that, first of all. And I hope it does set the stage in some way for today's topic, which is radical self-care, becoming a force for good in the world. So if you look up the word radical, it means far-reaching or thorough in a way that fundamentally affects the nature of something, right? And so when it comes to the idea of self-care, what I want to speak about today is an idea of self-care that includes the self, but ultimately transcends the self as well and goes far deeper than what we might usually think of when it comes to self-care. I also want to go beyond the typical oxygen mask analogy, which is a valid one, right, when it comes to prioritizing one's own self-care, by suggesting that our well-being doesn't just enhance our capacity to care for others, but that genuine, deep self-care can't happen, A, without caring for others, and actually depends on it, right? And so really this is about, by the end of it, really getting that cliche that, you know, we are all one, but more on that later. So why is this even a topic worth exploring? So I guess as Yumi hinted at earlier, you know, we are living in extraordinary times marked by rapid changes and unprecedented challenges, which I know that you're all aware of, right? And, you know, and are all impacted by to varying degrees. And so I wanted us to get a sense of those challenges. So first of all, there's the relentless pace of modern life. You know, we're constantly bombarded with information and we're expected to be productive around the clock, often by ourselves. You know, we are setting that expectation. And this always-on culture leaves little room for rest and recuperation. It's leading to chronic stress and burnout. The lines between work and personal lives have become blurred, and it's really making it difficult for us to find balance and to prioritize our well-being. So there's that. There's also then the increasing polarization, right? This deepening political and social divide that seems to just be growing and growing. This polarization doesn't only cause stress and anxiety at sort of a underlying level, but it also fosters a sense of isolation and disconnection from other people, which is so important for our well-being, right? Being able to connect with others. We know that social media amplifies these divides, and we know that it often presents this distorted view of reality that can increase the polarization, but also exacerbate our feelings of inadequacy and loneliness. Then we also have the cost of living crisis, right? With economic inequalities that are widening, it's leaving many of us struggling to meet basic needs. And the struggle creates environments that are ripe for despair and frustration. To go a little deeper, and there's a reason why I'm digging into this, but to go a little deeper, you know, I'm sure you've all heard about the concept of the polycrisis, right? This convergence of multiple intersecting crises such as climate change and pandemics and wars and geopolitical instability. You know, we know that each of these crises amplify the other, creating what is being called the large meta-crisis, right? And so this meta-crisis speaks to, and you know, I'm curious as to whether this is something you sense as well, but it speaks to this pervasive sense that our societal systems are failing us in some ways, are potentially unraveling on multiple fronts and leading to, you know, potential existential uncertainty and fear. And I know, having spoken to friends and to colleagues and to clients, that this is something that people are grappling with. And so in this landscape, you know, it's no wonder that so many people feel overwhelmed. This pressure to keep up combined with the stresses of daily life and the broader societal challenges, they can take a significant toll, and they are taking a significant toll on our physical health, mental health, emotional health. And when we're constantly in this survival mode, it becomes really difficult to think about self-care and thriving, let alone helping others to thrive, right? But we know we have to, because if we do more of the same, we'll get more of the same, but not just the same, but likely a deepening and a widening of the problems that we're faced with today, because we'll become increasingly stressed, depleted, fearful, potentially nihilistic, potentially hopeless. And this can not just deplete us, but really distract us from what is really important in our lives. And so in the face of all this, radical self-care, it almost becomes like a powerful act of resistance. By practicing self-care in the way that I'm going to present today, or invite us to think about today, we cultivate the awareness and the agency and the acceptance and the resilience and the compassion and the courage that we all need to step outside some of these damaging norms and become a force for good through whatever circle of influence we happen to have. Now, as potentially heartbreaking and overwhelming as these recent global crises over the past few years have been, I wonder, or I think that they also open up a liminal space of sorts, right? A threshold where potentially old ways of seeing things, doing things, old structures, they can potentially dissolve or break down, making way for new possibilities, right? And I know, speaking personally, the past few years have really forced me to do some serious soul searching to determine what life is really about and what life is asking of us. And so this time of uncertainty and this time of upheaval, it can be a time of opportunity. And I'm sure you've heard that being said before. Now, I see it as an opportunity to potentially review, to reset, and to realign our path as individuals and as a collective in a way that truly honors this gift of life that we've been given. We can shift from being co-creators, and I'll use some maybe harsh language here, but slaves to a system and a way of living that is damaging to life, including our own, and instead become self-determining and sovereign agents working towards flourishing for all. And that really lies at the heart of what I'm talking about today. And so today's session is very much about authentic flourishing amidst the challenges and deeply recognizing the relationship between individual and collective flourishing. And so over the past 15 years, this question of what will help to bring about human flourishing has become one that I've become really interested / obsessed about. I think my colleagues might tire of me talking about flourishing all the time, but I think it's really important. And this is the outcome that I think radical self-care should aspire to. So on that note, I'd like you to have a guess as to what percentage of the UK population is flourishing. And that's compared to getting by, to languishing, and to struggling. So before you share your answers, and maybe I'll invite you to share your answers in the chat. I can't see the chat actually, but anyway, I'll ask you to share your answers. Oh, there, I can. Let me just get us on the same page in terms of some basic definitions when I'm talking about flourishing, getting by, languishing, and struggling. So flourishing, I'm talking about an optimal state of mental health where you experience high levels of psychological, emotional, and social well-being, where you are growing and expressing your potential in life, ideally in service of a cause that is deeply meaningful to you. So that's what I'm talking about when I say flourishing. Getting by, this reflects what's described as adequate mental health, where individuals are managing daily life, but they're not thriving, they're not feeling particularly fulfilled. Languishing, which I think became quite a buzzword during the pandemic, describes a low state of mental well-being, where individuals feel stagnant, disconnected, and lacking in motivational purpose. And struggling represents significant mental health challenges, where individuals are experiencing substantial distress and finding it really difficult to cope with daily life. So given all of that, in the chat, perhaps share your percentage in terms of what percentage of the UK population This is based on a global study by AXA, by the way. What percentage is flourishing? I'd just be keen to see people's thoughts before I share the data from this study. And it is obviously a averaged percentage based on a group size, right? The group size from the study. The study involved 16 countries across Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. So we've got some pretty low numbers there. I'll tell you what the answers are now. Now, bear in mind, there are various studies. The one I'm referring to here is an AXA Mind Health study done in 2023. And these were the numbers. So the number of people flourishing here are probably a lot higher than what a lot of you shared in the chat there, which is interesting. As you can see, 23% of people in the study were flourishing in the UK, 30% getting by, 26% languishing, and 21% struggling. So based on this study, what this means is that only around 2 out of every 10 people in the UK are able to express their human potential in life, which means that 8 out of 10 will have, to varying degrees, a compromised capacity to enjoy vitality, to foster deeply fulfilling relationships, to realize personal professional goals, and to contribute their gifts and strengths to society in the way that they are, I guess, in the way that they were born to or have the potential to. And interestingly, across the 16 countries in the study, like I said, Europe, Asia, North America, and South America were the 4 continents. The UK had, by quite some way, the highest percentage of people struggling, followed by the US. As we probably all know, depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide, according to the WHO. And in line with the UK stats, less than a quarter of people in developed countries, so places where, for the large part, basic safety and security needs are primarily met, less than a quarter of people are flourishing. So what this makes me think is that the conditions that we are, to some degree, co-creating, and I say to some degree because there are obviously factors outside of our control, and the way that we are showing up in life for ourselves and each other isn't working if well-being and flourishing is our collective goal. And so the question then becomes, fine, what will work? Now, it's obviously not a simple answer, but when it comes to human flourishing, there's a whole scientific field of research dedicated to it, namely positive psychology, right? And so from my perspective, it makes sense to start there. But what I want to do here is, rather than just make this about positive psychology and just rattle off all the evidence-based interventions, I want to approach it somewhat differently. I want to propose a framework or way of thinking about human flourishing that is informed by the actual evolution of positive psychology as a field of study. Because I think this evolution can serve as a clue for us and guide us as to what deep, radical self-care is and what human flourishing is and why it's essential for us to take this approach in the world we find ourselves in today. And so I will speak to some of the research and evidence, of course, but it's not just going to be about this, what the research said. This is also going to be about how I, as a messy, complex human being living in the real world, have brought this to life in my own life, and an invitation for you to reflect on what it all means for you in your own life as well. And if anything, find in what I share ways that are resonant for you and that may be helpful for you, right? But we'll get to that a bit later. So what I want to look at here is this evolution of positive psychology. And we'll start with the origin of positive psychology, what is now known as the first wave. So I'm aware many of you will be well versed in this, so I'm not going to go into too much depth, but let's look a little bit at the history here. So the first wave of positive psychology emerged in the late 1990s, led by psychologists like Marty Seligman and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the father of flow. But the term positive psychology was first mentioned in the 1950s by Abraham Maslow. And so Seligman was certainly building on the shoulders of a few giants. Positive psychology, as you know, focuses on optimism, hopefulness, gratitude, happiness, and other positive attributes, and seeks to explore and build on individual strengths rather than weaknesses. So this movement arose as a response to the focus on pathology that had dominated psychology since, let's say, the 1950s, to focus instead on human flourishing and well-being. As you know, traditional psychology had been concentrating on diagnosing and treating disorders, but positive psychology sought to understand and promote factors contributing to a fulfilling life. Now, Seligman's PERMA model, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, it became the most well-known framework for understanding well-being. And after a few years, the H was added as an extra domain, which represented health and spoke to the role that health plays in our psychological well-being as well. So I want to just briefly touch on each domain just so we can all get on the same page here. So positive emotions. This is less about pursuing positive emotions. It's more about experiencing positive emotions through things like gratitude or savoring day-to-day moments or cultivating optimism, and then in enjoying the mental and emotional well-being that comes with emotions like joy and contentedness and inspiration and so on. And so the aim here is to experience more positive than negative emotions in one's life. And there's been studies done on this in terms of like the ratio, etc., but I'm not going to go into that. The overarching takeaway is that we obviously experience greater degrees of well-being if we have more positive emotion than negative emotion. Move on to the E, engagement. This speaks to just engaging fully in our lives. It involves absorbing ourselves in meaningful activities, finding flow, discovering and applying our strengths in our day-to-day lives and work. It's about being present and intentional in our activities instead of, running around like automatons. And there's a real fulfillment that comes from this kind of engagement. Then there's relationships, specifically positive, healthy ones. So this speaks to the well-being that comes from being part of a healthy, supportive relationship or community. It's about building mutual respect and care and intimacy and connection in our relationships. And it includes the relationships we have with our partners, our friends, our family, our colleagues, and our community. Meaning, this speaks to a human being's inherent need for value and worth. And when it comes to flourishing, it's really more about this pursuit of meaning rather than the pursuit of happiness. And this meaning can be found in our work, in our home lives, through religion, volunteering, social causes, through creativity, living our life in alignment with our values, and so on and so on. The A, achievement, speaks to the sense of accomplishment that comes with things like mastering new skills or working towards and reaching worthwhile goals, savoring successes. And the research shows that intrinsic goals, such as developing oneself, they can lead to greater impact on well-being than more extrinsic goals like making money. Finally, on the health side of it, this just speaks to that body-mind connection. When our physiology is healthy and balanced, we feel less stressed, more resilient, and experience more positive emotion. Now, as you're all aware, the three key factors here: sleep, exercise, and nutrition. Now, in my own life, as I mentioned, I went from someone who was experiencing depression and insomnia for a decade. I struggled with mood swings, with utter exhaustion, with physical ailments, and with a real sense of meaninglessness that came with all of that, right? And I was able to, like I say, with the support of others, shift towards someone who over a few years was able to find a lot more energy and strength and purpose. And it came down to just cultivating new habits and changing the lens through which I viewed myself, others, and the world. So, without being too trite here, it was about, for me personally, shifting from glass half empty to glass half full kind of attitude or perspective. So to bring this to life, I want to just speak to some of this in a bit more detail. So for me, the foundation for all of this was my physical health, right? I started exercising every day. I don't exercise every day now, but in the beginning I did, and it really dramatically changed my self-confidence, my strength, my energy, and so on. I also dramatically changed my eating habits, just focusing on real unprocessed food. I began practicing deep breathing exercises and simple mindfulness techniques, which for me helped me become more present, more intentional, and at a physiological level helped me to engage and activate my parasympathetic nervous system more, which helped me to find more calm and balance. And these habits together played at least some part in helping me overcome my decade of insomnia. But there were other things that helped me in this regard as well, right? Like weaning myself off my sleep meds, following a consistent sleep routine and timings, embracing the no blue light at night rule. I still do that now. It took a while for my wife to come around to it, but we have like red lights we put on at night. And anyway, it definitely helps with sleep. And then just some of the basics, right? Doing what you can to maintain a cool, dark, and quiet sleeping space. But all of this over time has helped me now to enjoy, on the large part, healthy sleep, which I would never have imagined during my times of insomnia. So, intentionally prioritizing my physical health was a critical part of my transformation. And it also really helped me just to show up with more energy in the world. It's really the foundation upon which we build everything else, right? But there were a few other practices that proved valuable for me in boosting my personal well-being and sort of driving the transformation that I had. So one of those things was that really played quite a key part in shifting and maintaining a new trajectory in my life was future visioning, which I did through journaling, right? So for me, this involved projecting myself into the future, deeply exploring the type of person that I wanted to be, the kind of work I wanted to be doing, the kind of life I wanted to be living, the kind of strengths that I would develop and leverage in service of all of this, and what values I would embody to move towards this. Now, when I was doing all of this, my life was very different to what I was describing. But I felt it, I connected to it, I kept at it. And I spent quite a lot of time deeply connecting with this future vision of myself and of my life. It led to me, creating a series of statements describing how I would show up as this future self. I would then repeat them and internalize them as part of my morning routine, I guess, affirmations, right? And what all of this did was help attune me to this, I guess, to my best version of myself, but also prompt me towards a different way of showing up in the world in the present. You may have come across Seligman's work on this. He calls this type of work prospection, and research into it shows that it elevates our mental health, it enhances our sense of meaning, develops optimism. And I think he described it as drawing oneself into the future through your vision, which then impacts your choices and behaviors today, rather than being held back by self-protective and oftentimes self-limiting behaviors born from the past, right? So that was really powerful for me. One other journaling practice of mine that really, I guess, transformed my mindset and how I felt in the world was gratitude journaling. Now, one study by Seligman and his colleagues showed that one single gratitude journaling practice led to a 10% increase in subjective well-being, or let's call it happiness, and a 35% decrease in depressive symptoms. And this effect lasted for 3 months, which I think is quite amazing, right? But the real power of gratitude comes with the regular practice. So for me, it became a part of my daily ritual first thing in the morning. I think we all know that regular practice produces the natural and healthy release of serotonin and dopamine, which serves to boost our mood. It also strengthens the neural pathways involved in gratitude, just making that kind of disposition and way of attending to the world more natural for us. So research has shown that regular gratitude practice enhances our optimism, our self-esteem. And so it's really almost like a super personal well-being practice, right? If you could bottle the effects of gratitude and turn it into a pill, I think you could make a lot of money off it if you're that way inclined, right? But importantly, it also enhances our selflessness and our empathy, making it a critical concept within radical self-care, right? But we'll come back to that a bit later. So what I'd like to do now, if you don't mind, is invite you to join me in a practice where I combine some of what I've just spoken about, some of the stuff from first wave positive psychology, some of the practices that I've done in my own life, as a way to intentionally enhance our physical, our mental, and our emotional well-being. So if you want to turn your cameras off, feel free to, but also feel free to keep them on. And just start by finding a comfortable position in your chair and just take a few moments to settle. We'll just start by taking a few deep breaths, just filling our lungs completely from the belly to the lungs to the chest, just holding for a bit and releasing and exhaling. And just come into the body, notice yourself in this space right now, perhaps feel the ground beneath your feet, the chair beneath you, and just get a sense of gravity really supporting your body in this moment. So we're going to just do a few rounds of deep breathing. I'm not going to do any counting here. I'm going to invite you just to count, to breathe at your own rhythm. But what I do ask you to do is to breathe deeply through your nose, to fill your lungs completely, to hold your breath for a second or two, and then to exhale slowly through pursed lips if you can, allowing that exhale to be a lot longer than the inhale. And we're just going to repeat this deep breathing cycle a few times. And each time you exhale, just really invite and allow the body and the mind to let go a little of any tension that may be showing up for you right now. And just notice the sensations that come with the breath as you breathe deeply through your nose, as you hold that breath for a few moments, and as you exhale slowly through pursed lips. Now just allow your breath to find its natural rhythm as you start to pay real attention to the breath itself, just noticing the flow of air as you inhale the air into your body and exhale it out again. Become deeply curious about the breath as you do this. You might notice how it's warmer all the way around, as it's cooler as you breathe in and warmer as you breathe out. So allow your breath to really anchor your awareness and your attention to the present moment and to anchor to the now. And if your mind wanders, we just notice that without judgment and gently invite it back to the breath. You may choose a specific spot in the body to focus on, perhaps the space just below your nostrils, perhaps inside your nostrils or your chest or your stomach, wherever you can best feel and notice the breath. Just hold your attention there for a few more moments. As you stay aware of the breath, it's allowing your breath to breathe itself. Just imagine yourself 5 years from now and see if you can bring to mind what living, I guess, the best version of your life or being your best self in 5 years' time, what that looks like, what that feels like. In other words, what is your aspiration for yourself in 5 years' time in terms of how you are showing up in the world, relating with others, the work you are doing? Just really sense into that and visualize the details. If you're a visual person, you might see where you are and see what you're doing. Just really connect with this future vision of yourself. Perhaps explore what strengths and values will be showing up for you in your life and how these will be making a positive impact in the lives of others. And just allow whatever arises to arise as you practice this inquiry and visualization. And just feel into any shift in emotion that arises through this visualization. Let go of that now and just come back to the breath, come back to the body, and invite you just to reflect on the past week. Just bring to mind something that happened that you're grateful for, that you're glad about. Just allow that to arise in your mind. And when it has, just relive this experience in your mind's eye, perhaps recalling what happened, even recalling any sounds and sights and sensations, really bringing it to life again as best you can. And just notice how you feel in your body and in your mind as you replay this experience from your memory. And as you do that, just think about who helped you or perhaps played a role in this positive moment. And in your mind, just imagine them in front of you and give thanks to them with a real, genuine sense of gratitude. And if you feel so inspired, perhaps even make a silent commitment to yourself now to actually thank them in person when you have the opportunity. Let go of that now and invite you to take one more deep breath in through the nose. Hold for a few moments and then a long, slow exhale out through the mouth. And when you're ready, you can perhaps roll your shoulders back and forward for a little bit, move your neck side to side, and if your eyes have been closed, you can open your eyes. So I hope you enjoyed the practice. Like I said, just a bit of a mishmash of some of the stuff that I found very helpful in my own life. And I would say really that over a certain period, it was my utter commitment to all of the stuff that I've shared so far over this period of years that really helped me to experience the kind of transformation that I did in my own life, right? But at some point in that transformation, this newfound commitment to positivity and well-being, I actually started to experience its shadow side, which for me became, I became, I guess, what I would describe as allergic to any negativity, right? I refused to indulge in anything remotely negative. And ironically, I'm ashamed to say I sometimes became hostile if someone brought their negativity into my space. This is hardly the behavior of a compassionate, altruistic person, right? But over time, through working at integrating some of the darker elements of myself into my life and what I would describe as reconnecting with my soul, as it were, I started to experience a richer, more grounded form of well-being, which takes me on to the next stage of evolution of positive psychology, namely the second wave of positive psychology. So this second wave emerged as a response to the criticisms leveled at positive psychology, the first wave of positive psychology, where it was perceived by some to have this sort of single-minded focus on positivity. And what the second wave of positive psychology did was argue for a broader perspective of what well-being means, which includes the full spectrum of human experience. And so one of the risks inherent in this first wave was that, with the positive qualities being proposed as so beneficial and to be pursued and so on, that negative aspects of our life would be seen as undesirable and to be avoided. And as I've mentioned, that is what happened to me. And so the second wave, led by researchers like Paul Wong, really integrates the darker aspects of human existence and recognizing that true well-being involves navigating adversity and the full spectrum of human emotions. So the focus shifted to a more holistic understanding of flourishing, and that acknowledged that growth very often occurs through difficult situations or difficult emotions, and that in fact, we grow the most when we encounter our suffering with the fullness of our humanity. And so in this second wave, it's this dialectical interplay between the so-called positive and so-called negative that leads to deep well-being. And in fact, it actually even questions the notion of positive and negative phenomena, right? Including emotions, as very often those are contextually dependent. And so it becomes more about how we navigate all of experience, including the difficult stuff that we often seek to avoid or hide away from, in a way that leads to positive, life-affirming outcomes. It's very much about the outcome here. And it becomes, like I said earlier, more about seeking and creating meaning in the face of challenges and in the face of suffering than pursuing happiness. And so this is very much a perspective and an attitudinal shift. And like, the way I see it, it's territory of the soul, which can often be ineffable. But there are also practices, many of them introspective ones, that can help us to better acknowledge and open to and integrate the darker aspects of ourselves and life in a way that leads to a deeper, more soulful life. We can help to surface these parts of ourselves through journaling about our difficult emotions or experiencing. We can do it through recalling dark aspects from our dreams and journaling about those, or just staying open to and aware of our emotional state and really just choosing to be with our difficult emotions rather than distracting ourselves from them or becoming overly reactive so we don't give ourselves the space to really feel the emotion, right? But it's key to recognize that saying all of this, it's not about self-flagellation of any kind. This has to be grounded in self-compassion. And so we'll briefly look at self-compassion through the lens of Kristen Neff's work. She speaks of 3 elements of self-compassion, which I think are important to keep in mind when we start to work with our own suffering or darker aspects of ourself. So the first element of Kristen Neff's sort of, self-compassion is the concept of self-kindness versus self-judgment. And this is something I really had to develop personally because I had, for various reasons, become very critical of myself. And it's at its heart, this is an invitation to relate to ourselves and to our challenges as we would, a good friend, which I'm sure you've heard of before, right? This means being warm and kind and understanding and supportive of ourselves and of our difficulties. So that's the first element. The second element is recognizing our common humanity versus seeing our suffering as something that isolates us from other people, right? So at the heart of this is the recognition that all of us, despite our differences, that all of us suffer. We might suffer in different ways, but when we become aware of and really face our own suffering, it's important that we see this as the thing that connects us to other human beings, which is really, really important in today's world, right? Where our oftentimes silent suffering seems to create even more of a divide between ourselves and others. Then there's a third element, which is about practicing or cultivating mindfulness in the face of our suffering versus overly identifying with it. So one of the core aspects of mindfulness is this attitude of receptivity and acceptance, which in relation to suffering means neither suppressing or magnifying our pain, but instead turning towards it and really holding it in an expansive and grounded awareness. So this doesn't mean we don't feel our pain. We have to feel our pain, right? But through cultivating mindfulness in the face of it, we experience the pain as part of something far larger and hold it in a larger awareness and perspective that, I guess, helps us bring some perspective to it. And this is important, right? Because we, just as we can't learn from or grow through our pain, when we turn away from it and ignore it, we also can't learn or grow or integrate from our suffering when we are overwhelmed by it. And so, I guess at its heart, this is what the second wave of positive psychology is about. It's about seeking meaning in our suffering and in the suffering of the world. And it's about feeling deeply into the suffering, but cultivating a sense of hope in the face of it. Now, research has shown that when we are able to do this, we aren't made smaller by our trauma, but we experience post-traumatic growth through it. And I've come across studies relating to 9/11 and to COVID, which support this. And there's a name for this process, or I guess attitude. And it was coined by Viktor Frankl as part of his logotherapy, which is all about searching for meaning in life and choosing hope amidst suffering, right? And the term he coined was tragic optimism. So he described tragic optimism as the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain, loss, and suffering. So the way I see this, it's about owning our life story in a meaningful way, not letting the life story own us. And it involves recognizing that suffering and tragic events are part of a bigger story of our life. And in so doing, it really invites us to, take a step back to see how the pieces fit together. And in the face of our many crises over the past years, I think this is really a critical perspective and attitude to cultivate. It's certainly not toxic positivity. In many ways, it's antithesis. This invites us to really go into the suffering. Now, for me, there have been some practices that I've worked with over the years that have really helped me to shift from actually being toxically positive at one stage to being able to find a lot more depth in my sense of well-being by surfacing and facing the darker aspects of myself. And these include, inner child journaling. I'm sure you know about these. I won't go into any detail, but just speaking to your inner child, allowing that part of yourself to I guess share its perspective, to share experiences, traumas, and then allow your well-resourced adult to talk back to that part of yourself with love and acceptance and reassurance. Very often I would follow that kind of stuff with practicing mindful acceptance and just maintaining an open, receptive awareness of any difficult emotions that arise. There's a practice that I've done which I think is relevant here. Some people might think this is a ridiculous practice, but it's one that's helped me, I guess, stay close to my mortality, which I have found quite constructive, actually. For me, it's a chart that has 4,000 little boxes, each representing a week in an 88-year long life, right? Which is roughly how long we might expect to live. And each Sunday, I tick off one of those boxes, and it can become quite a ritualistic sort of meaningful experience, right? Some might see it as morbid, but for me, each time I tick off another week of my life and see what's left of it, I actually got a picture of it here. Where is it? There, that's my life in weeks. I guess it helps me face the inevitable, and it helps me stay connected to what is truly meaningful and important to my life. May or may not work for you, but it has worked for me. And finally, there is one other practice that I have found really helpful, and that is something called the 3-2-1 shadow process. And it's a form of shadow work named after the shifts in perspective that you take during a practice, namely moving from third person perspective to second person to first person. Now, before I share more about this, I obviously must say that this shouldn't replace therapy if that is something that you need, right, and something that you need to work through. But I've found that through journaling or mindfulness, this practice can help surface hidden aspects of myself, enhance my self-awareness, and ultimately help to move towards a greater sense of wholeness, right? It can also help with something that I think a lot of us fall victim to in today's world, which is projection, right? Shadow work is all about recognizing and working with our triggered emotional responses so that we can understand our projections and then own them as parts of ourself. So this doesn't mean we excuse people's wrongdoings, but it can help us break free from negative cycles of, let's face it, self-sabotaging and destructive ways of showing up in a relationship. Very often, these have something to do with our shadow. Now, as I'm sure you know, to varying degrees, shadows form during intense emotional lows or sometimes even highs when our psyche can't fully process these moments. And typically, these are from way earlier in our life, like during our childhood. We end up feeling pain or shame as a result. To protect ourselves, our psyche splits that part off from the rest of ourself. So let's say anger, for example, and then a fragmented self is created. So I'm obviously simplifying here, but we can then go on to identify someone who's never angry, and we just don't see that as who we are as human beings, but we become really triggered by other people's anger, for example. And a gross simplification, right? And everyone has some conditioned shadow response from childhood, and it can cause us problems, and it can keep us from a soulful wholeness and a deep humanity that comes from embracing the dark and the light. What I have found is by doing this shadow work, it frees up energy for personal growth, and ultimately helps you to become a more conscious version of yourself. So I'll briefly describe the practice, but if you resonate with it in some way, then do look up Ken Wilber. He's a transpersonal theorist and philosopher. And just look up the 3-2-1 shadow process. So very briefly, it involves, first of all, choosing something to work with. It could be a person, a situation, something that makes you negatively hypersensitive or become easily triggered or reactive, irritated, hurt. You get the picture, right? It might also be something that is coming up as like a negative emotional tone or mood that is really pervading your life. Once you've chosen something, I guess those are all clues that shadow is involved quite often. Once you've chosen something, the first step you do is to face it, and you do that in third person. So this involves bringing to mind as best you can the person or the situation or the experience and describing it in as much detail as you can. And you use third person pronouns for this. So, he, she, they, and so on. So this is your chance to really, I guess, let it out. The person's not going to read this, and so it's about being candid and honest and really describing the experience or the person and the impact it's having on you. So that's the first step. The next step is to talk to it. Now, this involves beginning an imaginary dialogue. You can do this, via journaling, written, or you could speak this out loud. But you use your second person pronouns here, like you or yours, right? So this is about relating to it. It's about entering into a relationship with the disturbance and asking it questions like, why are you doing this? What do you want from me? What do you want me to know? And really, you allow answers to arise by just imagining what its response would be as a person or a situation or whatever it might be. And it turns out that, very often some quite enlightening answers seem to flow from that. So once you've done that, the final step is to be it. And this involves writing or speaking in the first person. So, we use like pronouns like I and me and mine. And we really commit to then taking that on as ourself. We commit to seeing the world through the previous second person perspective that we've just described. So it's not just about finding similarities between that and us, it's about becoming it. And this involves taking on the qualities and the traits that we've identified in the previous step, by speaking or writing things like I am angry, or I am jealous, or I want money, whatever it might be the thing you just have totally dissociated from, not seen as an aspect of yourself, which has ended up triggering you in your life, leading to self-sabotage, issues in relationships. And it's about really owning this previously disowned aspect of yourself. It might seem like wrong in some ways, like, no, wait, that's not me. But very often, after a bit of self-reflection, we start to recognize this as an aspect of ourself. All of this leads you to gently owning this previously disowned part of yourself, and over time reintegrating it as part of who you are in a healthy way. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go into too much more detail. I've got half an hour left, but I can attest to its effectiveness. And if you're interested in checking it out, like I said, look up Ken Wilber and the 3-to-1 shadow process. As I said with shadow work, anytime we're encountering our own difficult emotions or suffering, it's key that we remain self-compassionate when working with our challenges or personal sabotaging or suffering. And so just remember to bring to mind Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion. And we can actually, I'm not going to go into it now, but we can actually, she's got something called a self-compassion break, where we actually work with the difficult emotion, whatever we are holding in that moment. We bring mindful attention to it, right? We acknowledge it as a moment of suffering. We acknowledge that it's really hard for us, potentially, that we acknowledge that we're struggling. So we bring mindful awareness and acceptance of it. We then shift into the common humanity part of it. We might work with statements like suffering is a part of life, or everyone experiences difficulties. I'm not alone in this. And then we shift to the self-kindness, like treating yourself like you would a good friend. May I be kind to myself, being patient with yourself, giving yourself the compassion that you need. So when it comes to human flourishing, this second wave of positive psychology really invites us to lean into the darker side of who we are, perhaps parts of us that we have hidden away from, because the research shows that it helps us to develop a deeper kind of well-being. It also helps us to be more resilient in the face of life's inevitable and necessary struggles. But we can't leave it at that, because we might run the risk of becoming too self-focused, which doesn't only impact those around us, but impacts ourselves as well, right? Which takes us on to this, I guess, most recent stage in positive psychology's evolution, which is the third wave. Now, third wave positive psychology it's in its early stages, so it's still being formulated, but its dominating feature is that it goes beyond the individual and its main focus of inquiry. So in an article by Tim Lomas, he's a prominent positive psychologist and researcher. He's also one of the leading voices in this third wave positive psychology. He said, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, but he said that the second wave positive psychology questioned the first part of positive psychology, namely the positive bit. But what the third wave positive psychology does is query the second part, namely the psychology bit, by looking more deeply at community and culture and the systems in which individuals and their well-being are embedded, right? Now, I'm not well versed in this third wave. Like I said, it's also in its infancy, but what it says to me is that it's critical for us to recognize the interconnectedness of individual well-being with the well-being of others, and the communities, society, and ecosystems that we share. And this means that true flourishing can't be an individual thing. It has to be a collective thing. And it must incorporate the broader systemic issues that impact individuals, community, society, and the planet. And so the invitation that I take from third wave positive psychology, whether this is the intention of the researchers or not, is to recognize and really recognize the deep interconnectedness of us all, and how our well-being is deeply intertwined with the well-being of other human beings, non-human beings, and the planet, right? So again, for me, this invites me to better understand the system that we're a part of, a system that we benefit from, but also a system that we're in some ways become victim of, a system that gets handed to us, but also a system that we co-create together, because we don't sit outside of the system, we are the system, right? And look, it's complex stuff that I haven't got my head around, and I have nothing to teach you on this front, but I want to share a bit of how I've been approaching this. So it's territory I'm still exploring, and I'm doing my own research and reading and listening. I'm being drawn to systems thinkers like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Carol Sanford and Nora Bateson. I definitely recommend checking them out, each of who in their own way is helping me to better understand this meta crisis that we are in a little bit better and understand my place in it. So some of the other practices that I guess help me to better connect to this interconnection, for me, it's like getting out into the woods. I live next door to some woods, so getting out into the woods every day, being with the trees. This might sound a bit hippie, but it's something that I do. It's a practice that helps me really connect more to nature and helps me to sense this ecosystem that I'm a part of. So that's been really important for me. I'm also seeking, like the proverbial ostrich, to I guess pull my head out of the sand to whatever degree it's buried in there, and truly see and feel this seeming unraveling of our society and the harm that's being inflicted on ourselves, each other, and the planet. It can be easy to turn away because it's more comfortable to do so, but I'm really challenging myself to look at this honestly. With that comes a lot of self-reflection, with the aim of being deeply honest and finding ways to take personal responsibility for the system that I'm a part of. I don't think we're serving anyone or some of the causes that we believe in if we always looking for the problem out there and pointing fingers and not starting with ourselves, right? So I recognize that during a session on self-care, and perhaps bringing all of this up might seem like a mistake, but as with the second wave positive psychology, facing our problems, facing our suffering, it's an essential part of healing and self-care and growth, and it applies to a broader perspective too. It's likely that every single one of you are already well aware of and deeply pained by the worsening climate crisis and the wars and the pollution and the destruction of our natural world and the widening inequalities and the lies and misinformation and the rising rates of childhood anxiety and depression and hateful polarization and so on, right? But what I'm working with here, just for myself, the next important step is to acknowledge how my very life is built upon and supported by the complex intersecting market forces that are also degrading individual well-being and relational well-being and social well-being and planetary well-being. And for me personally, this is asking me to learn more so that I can understand all of this a lot better, right? What I've definitely come to realize is that I definitely can't change things through anything I do personally. There are some deeply knotted, complex problems at play here, but nor can real change happen without me. And I think this applies to all of us. And so the way forward involves us each playing our part in a way that is humble and authentic, which, by the way, doesn't mean seeing ourselves as the superheroes who come and save the world, right? Nor does it involve telling people what to do. And so I hope that what I'm sharing isn't taken that way. It's definitely not the spirit that I'm coming from. It's more just me sharing my own experience, my take on this, and inviting reflection from you and your own unique way forward. And, there is no easy way forward, and I certainly don't have the answers, but what this third wave of positive psychology is inviting from us is to expand our focus beyond the self, which forms a critical part of radical self-care. And it's inviting us to cultivate altruism. So I was going to take us through a practice, but for the sake of time, I won't take us through a practice, but I'll just briefly speak to just a simple practice that we can do to cultivate more altruism. And I've slightly taken this from Matteo Ricard, the Buddhist monk. And this is just about, sitting down to practice, connecting to your motivation and just checking in whether you are approaching the practice with an altruistic heart or if you have more self-focused intention, and just ensuring that you are setting a clear intention of altruism and compassion. You then work to stabilize your mind through, focusing on the breath. This is a really important part of the practice. You You want to recognize and feel deep down that we all want to avoid suffering and we all want to find well-being. And this can, lead to, I guess, a kinder, more tolerant, more welcoming attitude towards yourself and others, right? You then move on to like sensing and recognizing the interdependence with all life on this planet and how tied up our own well-being is with the plants, the animals, and humans that make up this web of life. And then we move into cultivating empathy and love. And we start with a loved one so that we can really generate feelings of compassion and love in an easy way. You choose someone that it's impossible not to feel deep feelings of love for, right? And you imagine them, you send your feelings of love to them, you get filled with those feelings of warmth and affection. But then we extend that to other people in our lives, and then to strangers, to people who might have wronged us, to other creatures on the planet, and really then ultimately to the whole ecosystem that we inhabit. A practice like this, the more we do it, again, we're starting to strengthen neural pathways that help us to consider the world and attend to the world in this way. And so I think it's a really important part of radical self-care. So that's the evolution of positive psychology, at least with respect to how I relate to it and the way that it guides my thinking about human flourishing. And so I'd like to simplify things very quickly just by bringing this topic back to the title of today's session. So this is how I think of radical self-care in the face of all of this. I think that to become a positive force in the world, at least to become more of a positive force in the world, we need to commit to these three things. We need to proactively cultivate personal well-being. We need to acknowledge and honor inevitable suffering in our lives and in the world. And we need to transcend this hyper-focus on self, particularly in the Western world, and deeply connect with life around us, animals, humans, ecosystem. And through this, really get a deep sense of just how intertwined our well-being is with the well-being of others on the planet, and then make collective flourishing our goal. So that to me is radical self-care. Now, through these things, I think we become more of a force for good in the world. Cultivating well-being gives us the agency and energy to really draw on to make a difference. Honoring our suffering helps us to better accept the pain in our lives and in the world, which is inevitable. It's an inevitable part of human experience, and helps us to be more courageous in the face of adversity. Connecting deeply, when we connect deeply, we're able to cultivate and develop more altruistic motives and really claim our place in this living system that we are part of, right? Which then invites us to take responsibility for it. And so together, these commitments help us to be more resilient in the face of the challenges and the chaos of our world. They help us become more compassionate, and they help us to have hope. Now, not hope as in wishful thinking, but hope as in an aspiration for a better world, something that we choose to try and play our part in bringing about. And all of that comes out of really heartfelt gratitude and love for this life that we've been given. And that's a really important sort of piece to all of this. We really need to cultivate genuine gratitude and love for life. And so, I've got three questions here that, I pose to myself, and I guess I'm posing them to all of you. Simple questions. How will I proactively nurture my physical, mental, and emotional well-being? What negative aspects of my life, myself, do I struggle to accept, and how will I honor them? And what steps can I take to do less harm and add to the beauty and health of our society and the planet? So I guess I'll give you a moment just to reflect on those questions for a minute and just see what comes to mind for you. So how will you nurture your well-being? Are there any negative aspects or darker aspects of your life or yourself that you are perhaps struggling to accept? How will you honor them? How will you integrate them? And then through the lens of connecting deeply with life, right? What steps can you take to do less harm in the world and to add to the beauty and health of our society and the planet? So perhaps, and I can share these slides afterwards so you can come back to them, but perhaps you've got some answers arising for you. And if you do, what I want to ask now is, what is your or our biggest barrier to radical self-care? Ask yourself this question off the back of some of your answers you might have just come up with, but also just off the back of any thinking that you have based on what I've shared today, and really just make your primary focus the barriers that you notice that are standing in the way of really embracing what I've shared today. I just want to see if we are able to break into pairs. Now, look, I know if I break into pairs and if someone doesn't want to join the pair, then that person's left by themselves. So maybe we'll break into threes. I'm just going to invite you to very briefly, if we can create groups of three. I'll just give you 5 minutes just to explore this question. Give yourselves 1 or 2 minutes each to share what comes up for you. Yumi, are you able to put us into, let me see if I can, hold on a sec, breakout rooms.
So I think I can.
Great. So just like groups of three. Now, I ask that each of you give each other the opportunity to share, but it's totally up to you whether you want to share, and then just move into open discussion. Now, look, if you don't want to join your group for whatever reason, that's up to you, but I'm hoping that each group has at least 2 people in it. And if you don't, I really do apologize. We'll just give you 5 minutes, and when the time is up, you'll come back, and then we'll bring this to a close. So Yumi, could you put people into groups? I just invite you to reflect on what you think the biggest barrier to your or our radical self-care is right now. What I was saying was, I recognize we've covered some essentially, big and heavy stuff today. I'm talking about like, what role are we playing in the meta crisis and what are we invited to do in response to it, right? And there's definitely, it's an important question to ask, but I want to bring this back to our day-to-day lives where we, get to spend a rather short time on this beautiful planet of ours. I also want to acknowledge that we all have different circumstances. Some of us might have less time than other people. And so everything I've shared today is just like one take. And it's really about finding what meets you where you are at and works for you. Having said all that, I want to connect with what makes our individual lives worth living. And I presume many of you have come across Bronnie Ware's Regrets of the Dying, which I think can be a powerful guide for us when we ask ourselves that question. So, she was a nurse who, when speaking to her palliative care patients, noticed a few common themes that came up when she asked them if they had any regrets or wishes that they had done things differently in their lives. And as I'm sure many of you know, or might have read already, the top 5 themes were wishing that they had the courage to live a life true to themselves, wishing that they'd not worked so hard, wishing that they'd had the courage to express their feelings, wishing that they'd stayed in touch with their friends, and wishing that they'd let themselves be happier. So what you'll notice is that none of this has anything to do with growing GDP by working excessively or over-consuming, right? In fact, you could argue that, for most of us, it's perhaps these very things that are hindrances to spending more time doing what is truly important, which in turn elevates our spirits, helps us to connect more to one another and, to life itself, and helps us live more fulfilling lives, which really does have a ripple effect outwards. This doesn't have to be massively grandiose. I know I've spoken on grandiose terms, but this can just be about, your family, your organization, your community. When we live more fulfilling lives, the positive ripple effect is a very real thing. And so even if this is what we walk away with today, and it certainly isn't the first time that we've entertained this idea, but even if we just walk away with the idea that we should spend less time overworking, less time consuming, less time scrolling social media, and more time lifting up our heads and seeing and sensing the beauty in life all around us, so that we can generate the capacity and willingness to add to that beauty. That's really what all of this is about, right? Connecting with and appreciating the beauty of life and then wanting to add to that beauty. I think that helps us become a bit more of a force for good in the world. So, thanks for listening. We don't have much time, but if anyone has a question you'd like to ask, we've got like three minutes or so. Please feel free to raise your hand, or even a question or comment, but no pressure. But yeah, we've got about 3 minutes. Great. I think it's Laura, if I remember correctly.
Hello. Hi, yeah, Laura Kingston here. I was wondering what you were thinking that the biggest barriers are for radical self-care.
I actually think what I've just said now, I actually, it's going to sound a bit too political, but I'm not being political, but I think the market forces that drive us towards consumerism, working too much, and actually spending too much time on social media, because they've been designed to really capture our attention, to make corporations money, right? It's still part of the market force. I think that is what the biggest barrier to radical self-care. And so the invitation is to try and, in whatever way we can, become aware of that and unhook from it. in whatever way works for us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, for the question. Philly.
Hi. I think I just wanted to share that out of everything that you said, the very end really resonated with me. Not that the other part didn't, it did.
Sure.
But I think I personally feel a barrier to my radical self-care is, which I came to light with in listening to you, is that sometimes I'm so focused on like a desperation that other people, there's not enough people that are awake to this, and it makes me really upset. And what you said about focusing on adding beauty and not on those that aren't, and that links to, I think, the same thing about market forces is, and why I appreciate this platform, and the idea of being around like-minded people is that we get re-energized by that positivity, and focusing on that positivity creates that ripple effect, I think. So I just really want to say thank you for that.
Oh, pleasure. And thanks for sharing that reflection, Philly. There's someone that I really recommend you read if that's how you think about things, but I think it's a really powerful insight that you have, is Carol Sanford. She does some really brilliant work on systems, but she speaks about how our focus should look, we have altruistic motives, but our focus should be on how we show up and like our responsibility within all of that. And she presents it in a really heartfelt, compelling way. So Carol Sanford, Sanford, but it definitely aligns with what you have shared there. I think it's important to recognize the global issues at hand, but then to bring it back down to more sort of local focus and, ourselves. So yeah,
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, I know we run out of time, so thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I hope you got some value out of it. Thank you.